approach that I have taken. You can all hear me easily.
Yeah.
Okay, so there's no need for me to. So the approach which I took, I thought what we may need is to share some notes so that we can kickstart a dialogue and begin to reflect. Can move on to the next slide. So, if you look at Zimbabwe, when you look at Zimbabwe, you see that Zimbabwe has been in a protracted transition since the late 90s. And you see this transition started particularly after the changes which happened within our economy, after the institution of the economic structure adjustment programs, which were Bretton Woods-sponsored policies. And this had a major impact, particularly on the working class. And it actually led to also changes within the Zimbabwe Congress of Trade Unions to begin to take a note. And this is actually seen in the ZCT's document, Beyond ISAP, which came out around 1996, whereby it tried to look at what had happened within the economy, the industrialization, those of focus, and this became the bedrock. This became the bedrock upon which civil society was built, particularly in the late 90s. It organized and coalesced around the Zimbabwe Congress of Trade Unions, leading to the constitutional movement and eventually the opposition and so forth. So you find that the transition terrain has had many twists and turns. And I would actually want to fast forward to 2000. So you find that from 2000 becomes a critical year, because that's when we had the February 2000, 28 February 2000 voting no referendum, in which the government sponsored the Constitutional Commission laws against the National Constitutional Assembly, which was led by civil society. And the same year, that's when we also see the first land reform program coming into place. That was that's when it actually came into starting. And this, what it actually had a very big bearing on the economy, because the economy which we had in Zimbabwe was a largely agrarian class, a largely agrarian economy. So even the industry which we talked about in Zimbabwe was all agrarian industry, agro-processing. They were in one way or another linked to agriculture. And if you want to understand this, you just have to go to the town of Bindura. You have to go and see how the decimation of the commercial farms affected even in some of the key financial institutions. If you look at the key financial institutions which were in the agro industry, by then it was Standard Chartered Bank and Barclays Bank. And this is why they moved out. If you go to Chipinge, you see even the industries which were there, even like the dairy bottom. It was the second largest dairy plant in Southern Africa, but now it's not a because the industries that were linked, that was the feeder, was agriculture and commercial dairy agriculture, which was affected by fast food. So fast food comes in and it fundamentally changes everything. And with the decimation of that, you may want to look at the unions. Think of GAPUS, the General Agriculture and Plantation Workers Union of Zimbabwe, and how many? All in a moment, you no longer have farm workers. So the shift moves from farm workers, you now have A1 farmers, or the so-called new farmers, or farm invaders, depending on which angle you are. And that decimation of that aspect of it did not end there. Even the decimation of the industry, which is studied under ESA, but accelerated by fast trade. It also saw a change where we started to have unions dwindling in membership, because the workers were actually being retrained as industries closed. So this created a new society. But then you find that when you look at the also outside that reconfiguration of the political economy, which will expand further, you also look at, even when you look at the transition terrain, if you look at 2000 to 2012, the transition terrain was dominated by the opposition and its civil society allies. these were like the golden ages of civil society and the opposition movement. But from 2013, the transition terrain shifted from the domination of the opposition civil society allies to the ruling ZANU-PF. It came within the domain of ZANU-PF, and so it has been. So these are the kind of shifts which we have had in terms of the politics. So when you look at the shifts which I have talked about, the best industries and its attendant unions, you find that the economy slowly shifted, leading to rising informality. So the industrial working class began to be replaced by the worker peasant, that is within the rural, or worker owner in the urban, that is the urban type of workforce. Mostly one person concerns, and these were mostly one person concerns. And even if you want to see, want to do a quick throwback, if you look at, for instance, when the ZCT used to call for stayaways, particularly in the late 90s and the early 2000s, they used to be effective. There would be a total shutdown. But the moment we moved away from those industrial-based working class, I don't know what has happened. Yeah, you find that the stairway started to be called a floor because you now have one person concerned. You are talking to a vendor now. You are talking to a Shika operator. You are talking to a Mporogoza who lives on a hand to mouth to say stay away. And when you say stay away, you are simply saying stay away from eating. This is why you saw that over time, because they had in this shift. So even in terms of our organizing and civics, it started to be affected. Then, so you see that the trade unions, which were a fundamental force of CSOs, civil society, gradually experienced declining membership and resultantly influence in national politics. And by 2008, the trade unions had become in charge of themselves, leaving the public sector unions only as the dominant ones. But the challenge with the public sector union ones, you find that these were mainly under the control of government. They were determined because the biggest employer was government. Okay, let's move on. So, just to give you some snippets of what I'm talking about, the reconfigured economy, for you to understand this in perspective. If you see that 66% of the country's economy is informalized, and Zim is stated to be the third, the most informalized country in the world. That is according to the World. And if you want to check from Zepal actually estimates that we now have 500,000 to 1.5 million artisanal small scale miners. That is a small scale. And if you want to understand this for much further, look at the gold production and fidelity. Artisanal small scale miners are now producing more than the Arabism, not the Arabism, than the former large scale mining companies. So Makorogozas, when it comes to gold production, are now beginning town. So if we want to organize, these are some of the issues we want to understand. And for example, if you want to go to tobacco, so talk about there are 95,000 smallholder tobacco farmers. And that is it the 2020 to 2021 season when they claimed to have contributed 90% of the tobacco that was sold on the auction floors. And if you look, the tobacco now being traded at the auction floor has even surpassed the highest figures that the commercial farmers used to. So, and of these 70,000 are A1s, and about 25,000 hold around 20 hectares each. And then if you go by Jonathan was addressed by SAPES, he talks of 1.8 million households under the presidential support scheme. Get it? So this is just to give you, so you can even go and look at the Mushika Shika, the text. Unfortunately, we haven't yet had any study that has managed to produce the statistics. But anecdotal shows you to say, in terms of these groups, those Go Fasters, Wish, Wonder Feed, this, etc. That group is quite massive. That is not the dominant mode of transport outside the ecosystem. Then let's move on. So this is also from Zimstats. It actually gives you in terms by sector. If you want to understand how people are spread, this is where we are talking to say 94.5% of the labor for Southern is. So if you are saying 94.5% is employed here, you see that agriculture, forest, and fishing has got the highest number. Then you've got retail, trade, sell retail of motor vehicles, and those guys then Bakoma who fix cars. If you go into the business, the grocery stores or the shops in the high density who fix cars under a tree or maybe the home industry. And when you look at these people, these are ununionized people, all of these people. And yet before 2000, we still used to have all these trades being applied under industries in unions, but they are no longer in industries. They organized under industries and also under unions. So, also beyond the figures, I've given you the figures, what has happened to show the changes and the shifts. You find that what we have also seen during this period, that is from 2000, was an assault of the judiciary, and which has resulted in the loss of judicial independence. If you see, when the likes of Chengira, Winty, and Kamban invaded just Gabe's office during court sessions in court proceeding, protected Justice Fergus Blakey, etc. And we had changes around the judiciary which happened. Then we also had by this time as well, because of the fast track, because of the interests that were involved, we started to see politicization of the security sector and also members of the security forces becoming openly political active. And then also, we also try to see unprofessional security services, whereby even some cases will be referred by the police that these are political, which cannot interfere. You see, the issue of the rule of law becomes something else. Then also in terms of our politics, we start to see militarization of public affairs, where the military begins to move within what is usually considered the public domain or the civic arena. And you see them, if you look in parastatals, you start to see how they get into the boards, they run. And I think the Zimbabwe Democracy Institute, if Dr. Pesser and Mathieu would have shared a report where they start on this issue. Then we also see that in regulatory bodies, you see that there's strong free which is emerging. And even within the electoral body, the Zimbabwe Election Commission, when I say the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission, I'm even going back as far as the Electoral Supervisory Commission and the other electoral bodies which are there. And if you look, people who have been leading at the helm of this institution are ex-military, or they were actually people who were in service. And also what we have witnessed is also the issue of shrinking of civic space, which is the masking, we saw the masking of fundamental freedoms of citizens, and also constraining civil society space, how civic organizations operate. There's been so many efforts and laws which have come into place. And then what we also had, even after we had the 2013 constitution bringing some independent commissions, one thing which we have also seen, which has been systematic, is the defunding of constitutional bodies. And when I say defunding, you find that government has deliberately not created enough funding to make these constitutional bodies operational as a strategy to euthanize them. So what you end up having are euthanized independent commissions. That's why I put it there in quotation, because the independence is affected by lack of funding. Let's move on. So when you look at what has happened there, so you find that on the other hand, associational life shifted from formalized platforms to informalized platforms. And then citizens also became very individualistic and started to drift from the collective. So essentially now what we have is a highly atomized society in Zimbabwe because of the shifts that I've alluded to earlier on. So what does this mean? And coming now, so you find that generally evidence-based NGO analysis has been biased towards the fractals generated by political and electoral rights. But the reconfigured political economy has been deepening fractals also. So whilst we have been more steeped into the electoral cycle, in particular, I would not say electoral cycle, we've been steeped more into the issues of elections, voting, election observation, monitoring, but then not looking broader what has happened within our society. There are fractures which have been emerging elsewhere, and these fractures, they've got a bearing in terms of civil society work in Zimbabwe, and especially for human rights programming. Okay. So you see, if you look at land, you want to see look at land. Look at the cases of Arnold Farm, those the Manzo Farm, what has been happening, where you see people who were former perpetrators, rights violators becoming now victims. Even before November 2017, we saw it with some of the people who used to be rights violators rushing under the cover of civil society. When the likes of Mahia and Kamban, even Chris Mutampa, had to come to, but then after November 2017, maybe they forget it. Then you go to Chisumbanji, the issues around land conflicts, green fuel and the villagers there. Then same as Chilonga, then even have the issue of S. Dakeni Farm, now bringing in even people like Obed, and you know how much land the guy has, but then says, I've got land for conservancy, but I don't have land for my crops. And when you look at this, it actually speaks, these things have come from the politics of fast track. We are now living in the morning after of fast track. So these are some of the issues emerging. And even if you would ask, I can see Rama going here. If you ask them, those who come from recently, they were fighting over the selling of Dangambura Mountain for a pittance. A whole mountain going at least of 7,500 US a year. So these are some of the issues which are emerging. And why is because of the politics of that. So even when you look at minerals, look at Chiato. It's well documented. The issue of Mutoko, you have seen what has been happening in Mutoko with the Chinese, etc. Then you even go to Bubi, Umbusa, issues around artisanal mining, conflicts between small-scale miners and farmers over land. Then we also have the issue of Gaika mining, which was very topical just a few years ago in the news, in the media. Then you have got red mine, where you also have the issues of people like Scott Sapanya coming in there. So this has become now the new arena of politics, or the new site of contestation created by fast track. But the question is, are we there? Are we alive to some of these new areas? Now, please move on. So even if you come to vending spaces, we've got the vendors versus the police, vendors versus municipal police, and vendors versus space barracks. And the informal industries, you see the issues of the vigilante groups, issues like Chipangano coming into play, even if you go to blend the industrial complex, if you talk to people who operate there, there are certain preconditions where you have to pay money. And even bus terminuses like MAR, for you to operate, where bus operators have to pay money, not to authorities. Then we also have political party functionaries. If you look at vetting spaces, for example, I gave the grassroots empowerment. There was one called grassroots empowerment, very topical in Copacabana. If you also go to Gulf, there's also another. So, and when you see, this is creating fissures because most of these were linked to G40 and now coming in with Lacoste. So it creates all these, these lines of fractures and context, which are most likely to breed conflict within society and also has a bearing on human rights. Then the issue of housing cooperatives, land barons versus residents versus the police, and residents versus government, that's both central and local. You see the demolitions which has been happening, etc. And then you look at the complexities which this raises, like for example, one interesting one is the issue of Budilo, the housing cooperative, where people were actually, houses were being demolished. And if you look at the history of this housing cooperative, it used to be a treasure base of ZANU-PF, and it was very prominent in 2008. But fast forward into 2020, 2021, they are now becoming victims. And yet, if you are coming from the transitional justice element, you've got these people where there are unresolved transitional justice issues around issues of political violence and torture. But now they've also become victims and wanting to come under the umbrella of the protection of civil society and also begin to enjoy the human rights which are protected. So this raises complexity to say, how do you deal with such kind of scenarios, what kind of cases? Then, even if you look at the issues around the pirate taxis in Mshikashi, and you see what has been happening, there's been clashes between the police and the police. And also, like I know it was in 2017, when one of the studies which I did looking at the violence within the pirate in Mshikashi taxis, where we now had the clashes between police and the soldiers, which were also coming in. And these were mainly over Mushikashika operators after the police had destroyed some cars for some of the soldiers. But what this potentially presents, when you see members within the security forces having this kind of clashes over ingress on resource distribution or over opportunities, it creates potential conflicts which can actually explode or spiral out of control. And even if you look at how the November 2017 transition happened, you could see the distrust between the security forces and how the police and the military were not in unison. They worked in a tangential process, even though one element ended up being dominant. Let's move on. Then there's that one, okay, yeah, the one on rapid urbanization. What we've also been experiencing, you see that we've had rapid urbanization not supported by industrialization. And when you see what has been happening, conflicts over land, I think there's a land about land barrels, and you see, if you go to communities like Ema, Doboshava, Caledonia, in particular Ema and Doboshava, where there are now clashes between some people coming from the urban areas and rural rights over land and then being sold. So this creates new lines of potential conflicts or fractures. Then, okay, let's move on. Okay, so if you look all those things which I've been talking about, we can say these are what I can call they are the key drivers of the fractures or line of contestation within the political economy. And I think I've tried to summarize them into about 7 points. And I think I've explained them. That's agrarian economy, informal economy, political elites. That is national and local, and also transnational capital. When you look, the influence of the Chinese and the Russian, particularly around the mineral resources, etc., and the issue of land. And I also put a very interesting one. I didn't know that call it national, transnational, the X-road element, particularly this is of going business in this big project. If you look at the very local issue, when you look at people like Kotse who are involved, and other how people, these former white farmers linked to Rhodesia and so forth, for a later for veteran, they call them X-road. But you see also them coming in and being reintegrated, but when they're coming in, at what cost? The conflicts which are being created. Then you also look at the ideological nature of the state. That is the blend of nationalist, military, authoritarianism, and public politics. Where now the military has now come outrightly open into our politics. To say, even if you go to mining, into business right now, it's very difficult for you to do any major business project without having some protection or someone being a godfather from the military, etc. And I think if you look, if you read Dr. Shumba's book, Zimbabwe's Spiritual State, it actually articulates that issue quite well and clearly. And also people like Shaw's work or within the mining sector, within the mineral sector. And we also have the issue of rapid urbanization without industrial stock, and then also the issue of obsolete colonial laws. That we've got obsolete colonial laws governing our society. Society is transformed. But when you look at the laws which we have, They are now outdated. The only piece of law which you can say is a bit more current is the Constitution and maybe the recent acts which have been done. So the question which you have is a so what? So the reconfigured political economy has serious implications in the way rights are protected or are not exercised. To say when machete gangs, when the Mashurubis go around with their members fighting and beating people and violating citizens' rights, or the Majapan there in Redwood, when you see the police saying it's political, we can't prosecute them. It's not illogical. It's actually informed by this reconfigured political economy. Because there are interests of big people behind these people. These people are front of interest. So in the end, what you see are violation of citizens' rights. And these are some of the issues which we need to take into account. So you see that human rights terrain has become a complex minefield. So the question is, for instance, how do CSO respond to situations where perpetrators are now victims of rights abuses? I have spoken about this. To say when you see people who were involved at the initial phase of the fast track or the Jambanja land reform program, there are a lot of rights violations. Not saying that the land reform was not supposed to happen, but there were lots of human rights violations which happened to ordinary citizens. Not just forget the white farmers, because if they say white farmers, people say, no, you don't know racism. But if you go to the Zimbabwe Peace Project years ago, it documented this quite well. And I also think for Hill Zimbabwe, they've documented this quite well. And some of these people now, they are now people who are now become also even victims, who were victims within Mugabe's dispensation, and even now within the Second Republic. And the question is, how do you deal with this? And from a transitional justice perspective, what does it mean when you've got old and healed wounds? Now, also mixing with new wounds, but those new wounds are responsible for the old and healed wounds. How do we promote healing? Bishop. You see, Reverend, how do we promote? So these are some of the questions that I'm bringing to you as human rights defenders, as people working within the democracy rights government sector. So the human rights movement and defenders must update their analysis to inform programming based on society as it is constituted and not what it ought to be. So this means civil society interventions must resonate and speak to citizens' lived experience. And I believe this conference is the beginning of the many process to rethink human rights work in light of Zimbabwe's reconfigured political economy. So, what I've done is to try and problematize. You know, it's always good to point at the problem. The most difficult part is coming with the solution. And this has also been something which has been quite difficult for me. I'm still grappling with the solutions, and I think this is a conversation which we need to have. I don't have the silver bullet, I don't have the panacea. But what I managed to have were some specialized looking glasses, which I could use to pick. If I were Prof. Maduka, I would say the special legal lens. But this was not a special legal, it was a special political economy lens to pick into Zimbabwe society, to say, okay, this is what it is, and this is what it potentially means. And I think what we need now to do, maybe in other process before and also going forward, is to begin to think about the solutions. How do we respond? How do we inform? But at a minimum, I try to come to some few points. I believe the 2013 Constitution should act as our point of departure, despite that already there has been some assault on the 2013 Constitution. There have already been some amendments which have been done. So, and some of these are not that so much progressive. So, we need to update and sharpen our tools of analysis. And this is something which we need to constantly do on a daily basis. then we need to rethink civil society and see how some local community-based organizations can be supported or linked up with the traditional civil society organizations. How do we bring in the old and the new? I remember when we started writing Garaptas, this was a big debate when the new social movement, the new digital movements came in, and I know Dr. Marigere here contributed largely to that debate. To say, how do we have a conversation between the new and the old? This is something which civil society needs, because already the new ones have been born. Forget those who say the beautiful ones are not yet born. The beautiful ones are born, but the question is, are we seeing the beautiful ones? Or we are just seeing the old ones? We are just seeing ourselves, the old Mandalas. Whenever we look in the mirror, we think that we are the only ones. Then, so you see that traditional civil society need to rethink their community and get to the strategies. And they may not have the same access and leverage with CPOs, resident groups that may not be known at a national level. So there are those small organizations which are not known. And the question is, if you go into the communities, don't listen to people who say that there is no civil society. Civil society is there. If I will take you right now, I will tell you, if you go to Nigeria, there is a borehole committee. That's civil society. Committee Rechi Boran. The women savings clubs, my clubs, that's civil society, it's associational life. But then the question, do we see it? Do we see the linkages? Do we see the synergies? Do we appreciate them? That is where the crux is. So what this means, it means we need to innovate in terms of how we engage. And also, we need to innovate on how to record human rights violations. And also, technology offers many possibilities. I've seen a lot of cases of human rights abuses on social media, which have ended up in the police and also civil society harnessing them and pushing authorities to act. For example, the Memory Machaya story is one story in which the social media played a prominent role. So forget those who say that the social media is useless. No, it's useful. But you understand that it's useful. It's like saying a bazooka is useless when you want to kill a mosquito. It's because you are not smart enough to realize that a bazooka cannot be used to kill a mosquito. All you need is just your palm or maybe a slippers. It can do the trick and be useful. Then, lastly, what I would say, of course, as somebody coming from an academic background, I would say civil society also needs to shift to evidence-based programming. There is need for more studies to understand the emerging social groups so as to inform our programming. Because one challenge which we have had, which I've noticed, is sometimes we talk things from a point of conjecture without testing some of the assumptions which we have. I just have my assumption, I sit, I write a proposal. I don't even try and understand to do a desktop research. When we say research, we don't mean that you need to find a budget. If you've got a laptop or a desktop and internet, there are many studies which have been done. Like, for example, those figures which I was giving you there. There are figures which I was actually getting from desktop study research, just going on the internet. If you take your phone now, if you type the number of smallholder farmers in the tobacco industry, they come on. In maize, it come on. That data is there. So that kind of research, so that even for you to say you want to go and do work in Muzaraban, do you understand Muzaraban is political economy? Who is in Muzaraban? What are their interests? How do people act or earn their living? Those key questions are very important to understand. Who are the political actors? What are the drivers of political decisions or the motivations of citizens when you come into civic and political processes? So I think this was my last slide. I think I've ended up talking too much. I ran away from the seminar. I almost became a referee in my life. So sometimes I love talking, but Basically, this is what I had for you.
We will ordain you one.
Okay, thank you. So I've brought you more problems to ponder about and more questions to ponder about, but I'm saying in terms of the solutions and how to move forward, can we have a dialogue? And I think it's very good that Rio Zimbabwe has kickstarted this kind of dialogue, and they've brought the issue of the political economy into question, because we said, okay, what does then human rights have to do with political economy? But I think I tried to show you and to give you even some examples. And I know some of you are already grappling with some of the examples that I was citing. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Moa. I guess we all learned a lot of things. Much more interesting to me, I think, is the connection of all these analysis from figures to non-figures. And what it means is we should be able, as human rights defenders, as peace builders, as conflict transformation actors, and as people who stand up for human rights, as we have seen on that chart. It is very important that we understand how these different changes or transformations within our context, within our society, are actually. I did a lot of things, but I can't summarize all of them. I'm sure we all have learned something, and we have questions that we are likely to pose. We will have a second presentation, and then after that, we can go for plenary. But what was interesting for me, Komatamuga, is the way you have been able to tell us how the economic transformation has actually been informed by the changes in terms of the governance processes, political decisions that have been made in the country, and how this has also changed people from becoming living in a community of persons to individualism. And they have also mentioned or highlighted how the new arena is also shifted the way human rights are respected and are promoted, and how they are also affected by different actors. I think what is key is you mentioned a question about those who are perpetrators, they become victims, and how do you generate a discourse around that? How do you then promote human rights? How do you prevent human rights within that particular context? And this, I think the political economy analysis has also helped us to understand how the complexities that we see. If I was a victim previously, tomorrow I become a perpetrator, how are we going to manage that when it comes to the lenses of human rights promotion, protection, and also the building of a socially cohesive society within where we live? So for now, I will leave it there. May I please welcome Mr. Malvin Mukudu. Malvin is the advocacy officer for Mr. Zimbabwe. Mr. Zimbabwe simply means Media Institute of Southern Africa, like with a Zimbabwean chapter. He has close to 10 years experience as an advocacy within various organizations in the civic society. Malvin, please come through and talk to us. If you check on the program, we had Human Rights NGO Forum coming through, but they are delayed, so we'll have them in the next session. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Chairperson. I think you left out something very important. I did say I'm a pro-vaxxer on my profile, but you didn't tell people that I'm a pro-vaxxer. Yeah, it's always a hard. Okay, a pro-vaxxer is I'm just someone who is encouraging people to get vaccinated. We are moving together in this message that people should get vaccinated. We are saying we are commemorating Human Rights Day, and the right to health is also a very critical right. And as part of the work that we are doing, we are just encouraging people to get vaccinated. And I thought it's important for me to declare that I'm a pro-vaxxer, and I hope all of you are also pro-vaxxers. And it's a tough act to follow, and what's the pace like I but I will try my best to keep the room alive and in my presentation, I was asked to present on the media and human rights. Um, so I think all of us are aware of the media's role as a watchdog in our society in terms of how it exposes human rights violations, in terms of how it exposes corruption. But the key question to ask in Zimbabwe is that is the media in such a state to perform that critical role I'm talking about? We know that the media is the fourth estate, but in Zimbabwe, we have had a lot of issues that inhibit or that stop the media from acting as such. For example, our legislation architecture and even the sustainability of the media. Over the years, as Misa Zimbabwe and other comrades here, we've been advocating the government to repeal IPA, Access to Information and Protection of Privacy Act, which we thought was inhibitive of us to exercise our right to access information and for freedom of expression. Eventually, after the new constitution came into being, we saw the government admitting that IPA had clauses that were unconstitutional, and they agreed that we were going to reform it together and replacing it with the three pieces of legislation, two of which, as we speak, are already now acts of parliament. The first one being the Freedom of Information Act, which enables us to access information from public institutions, and the Zimbabwe Media Commission Act, which we hoped that it would effect co-regulation of the media. But despite overwhelming community demand for co-regulation, we saw the government renegating on it and then promising us that we would come up with a new piece of legislation that they said will be called the Zimbabwe Media Practitioners Bill. We are seized with that matter. We have provided a draft to them, but of course we are going back and forth. We've had problems with the Zimbabwe Media Commission, and also the government sort of like they are turning back on their words to guarantee co-regulation as articulated by various policy documents such as the IMPI report and also the constitution to a large extent. In terms of sustainability, Mr. Tamuka has already touched on that. We are having a very difficult economic environment where the media is unable to stay afloat. You have heard about the poor remuneration of journalists, even the media being captured because of its inability to sustain itself. We have also had the influence of social media coming in, which has also sort of interrupted the media business models as we know them. So we have a big issue of media sustainability, which then also has a bearing on how the media itself is able to play its watchdog role in terms of promoting and protecting human rights. I think if you've been following our work, we've had a situation where the sector of journalists and media workers continues to come under attack. I think when the COVID pandemic started, we had close to 30 attacks, that is arrest and harassment of journalists within a very short space of time, which then prompted Mr. Zimbabwe to engage into litigation, where we went to court and we were demanding that government makes media services as an essential services. So the court agreed with us, and the media was listed in that statutory instrument as an essential services. And this meant that we saw the arrest and harassment of journalists and media workers, including newspaper vendors, drastically going down. We also followed this up with engagement with national police leadership as well as the provincial leadership in various provinces, utilizing our advocacy committees, and we must applaud the police that we saw them sort of listening. But in this era, even one case of harassment or arrest of a journalist who is doing their work is one too many. We are striving to see a situation where we have zero arrest or zero harassment of journalists who are legitimately doing their work. Yeah, so I can just go by some names that we saw being attacked. You remember that issue where the state was looking for him, and he ended up having his cousin being abducted by state agents. We had the issues of Nashe Chokoza, Leopold all being attacked for doing their work, basically criminalizing journalism. This is problematic in that the Constitution is very explicit in that it says that there's a right for media freedom, and when these attacks are perpetrated on journalists, that right to media freedom is under threat, and when it's under threat, other attendant rights such as the right to access information, the right to freedom of expression are also under attack. We also saw maybe the right to livelihood coming under attack when journalists were being stopped from practicing their work. So all these attendant rights are affected if we don't have a free media environment. I've already said that. So one of the things that I was also asked to present on is to give an outlook of the elections as what the media role will be like. I think all of you, or some of you at least, are aware that on Friday, government enacted the Data Protection Act, which, amongst many things, in its preamble, it purports to be affording us rights to access information, freedom of expression, and privacy, but it has clawback provisions which we find problematic, like the criminalization of cyberbullying, which is a good thing, by the way. There's a lot of cyberbullying and polarization in the country. But the downside to it is that a simple in a WhatsApp group when you're debating about whether Ngapinde Nkuma now or EDP would land you in trouble, a cyberbullying. So what that might actually do is it will censor people, it will might go down as we go for elections. With, for example, the opposition having a disadvantaged access to media, especially public media, like the broadcasting platforms. This could be problematic in ensuring that the election is free and fair. I think many of you remember that we have an existing court case in which the ZBC was found not to be broadcasting in a fair manner during elections, and this is a precedent that has been set. But we also have SADC election reports, EU election reports that have said the same thing, that there is inequality in the way that coverage is given. All of us can push towards in terms of ensuring that that court case is implemented, and that those reports on how the media was operating in the 2018 election are also monitored and ensure that they are implemented. Yeah, so I've already talked about this, how digital rights will be under attack by this new Data Protection Act. We are going to see the right to privacy being under attack. I'm sure you know that contract has been made the data authority, and that could have ramifications in terms of how much personal data they have access to going forward. Many of you will remember in 2018 receiving text messages asking you to vote for certain political parties, and we were all wondering how a certain party accessed our phone numbers as well as our addresses for them to be able to send us those text messages. So with this kind of law that's coming, we tried our best to try and make government see that this law could be problematic in some areas, but with all advocacy, sometimes you lose, sometimes you win, and there were other months that they were going to forge ahead. So you can expect an environment where personal data may not be safe and will be used for nefarious objectives during the election. The rights to access information can also be affected, as well as the freedom of expression. I think we've also seen in the new law that fake news has been somewhat criminalized. You can prosecute it if you are found to have spread fake news with the intention, perhaps, of harming the other person. So, while that on paper is a good law, the issues that can come out there is that it can be abused, where political opponents will be targeted and forced into silence. So, what is the way forward? Conclusion is, from my pointers, I think we must insist going forward that government must honor its pledge to repeal IPA completely and replace it with progressive legislation. Like I said, we've already seen two of the laws coming in. They fall short of our expectations, but we still have the protection of personal information POPI bill, which has not yet been gazetted to complete the three laws that will replace IPA. We have seen Parliament in its timetable for next year saying they will debate the Broadcasting Services Amendment Act. So we hope that the Broadcasting Services Amendment Act can come in handy before the elections to ensure equitable access to broadcasting media as we go for elections. Many of you have seen that community radio stations have been licensed, but there are issues with their sustainability. Most of them don't have money to start operating, but also government has made sure that assisting them with finance is outlawed. So we are just going to have a lot of these community radio stations failing if something is not done, or there's no policy shift. So communities will continue to be deprived of information. The other thing I was talking about, we still have one state-owned broadcaster, ZBC, which will continue to be partisan. We'll see if they will adhere to the order that was given by the High Court in 2018. But if they don't do that, you can still expect to have a thoroughly biased view of our politics within television spaces and radio spaces such as Radio Zimbabwe. Like I said, it's not all been doom and gloom. We have a progressive freedom of information act, which now allows citizens to demand information through information requests, writing letters to public institutions and getting information. And one of the key rights that we need to exercise when we go to vote is the right to access information. There's a lot of information that we will need to inform our choices as we go to vote. And I want to urge everyone to utilize that Freedom of Information Act. I think for now I'll end here.
Thank you, Mama Marvin. Ndandizwisisa kuti tine mitemo yakawanda nditi inogona kutibatsira for us to express our freedoms, our views, but at the same point there are also other laws that are prohibited of promoting freedom of information in terms of access and also dissemination. Thank you, Marvin, for the presentation. I think it was quite enlightening. For most human rights defenders and the civil society in general, those who do peace and other activities, it is quite important to think much about how these laws will impede or promote our work, because with the COVID-19 continuing, it means most communities will not be accessible. And it is very important that we are able to utilize online media spaces to be able to disseminate information, to educate our citizens, but also to promote the rights of all people as we should. For now, may I please invite Bishop Magaya to give us this presentation, and thereafter we are able to then get into plenary. Bishop Magaya, you're welcome. Bishop is the director of Divine Destiny and is also a minister of the Word of God. I'm sure you'll be able to tell by his voice and experience that he's going to share with us. Over to you, Bishop.
Thank you very much. Well, I'm just trying to see whether my voice can project. Do you hear me? Can you hear me without me speaking into the microphone? No, it's running. Or you do okay. So ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. Thank you, Director Mahia and Zimbabwe team for putting up this very important conversation. The church and the state of civil and political rights in Zimbabwe. We are looking forward to the church, and I believe that in Zimbabwe, they say that we are 80% Christian. The question about the depth of that Christianity is a totally different chapter. But what is very clear is that every Sunday or every Saturday, every Friday, about 80 to 85% of Zimbabweans go to church and look up to the pastor for direction and, to have their opinion shaped. So church is going to be very, very important even in these discourses and in these very difficult challenges. So what is the role of the church in the preservation of peace and human rights ahead of 2023 general elections? Now, just as a starting point, I would like to say that it would not be inaccurate. It would not be inaccurate to posit that Zimbabweans bear indelible scars that are state-induced. So I would like to posit that Zimbabweans have indelible marks that are state-induced. Zimbabweans have had more seasons of regrets than those of happiness. It is just that we are a very gregarious people, very humorous, such that at times we tend to have lots of seasons of joy, but it will simply be cosmetic, trying to catch up with harsh realities. The cycles of political violence and state-orchestrated demolitions of people's shelters are a huge part of our history, with abductions, maimings, and killings being a major feature of these cycles. We have evidence of all this. From 19 when former Prime Minister Mugabe declared a national policy of reconciliation. The irony around that was that his compatriot, his fellow comrade Joshua Pomo was already running away from him. And so you have in 1983 to 1987, genocidal proportions, the massacres happening in Bukrawundi, in Matabeleland, which is commonly known as Bukrawundi, which very sadly, people have adopted that term, Bukrawundi, and yet what it really meant was a real denigration of a certain sector of the citizenry, right? So we are saying that we have had these cycles of violence. We have had cycles of political violence. We've had cycles of demolitions. Now, ironically, we are commemorating the International Human Rights Day at a time when the government also is advancing the PVO bill amendment, which is meant actually to violate further the human rights. Okay? This presentation, ladies and gentlemen, looks at the biblical approaches to such violations. I think this is very important for us to know that there are approaches that the Bible makes very clear. So we're going to look at the biblical approaches of the violations and further suggest both the theology of engagement and also the theology of resistance. The presentation also looks at what has the church been doing to preserving peace ahead of the forthcoming elections. Okay. So, right. So let me touch a bit on the Bible and governance. The Bible and governance. What is it that the Bible says about governance? Now, whilst ancient Israel had a theocracy, I just want to explain a bit here what theocracy means. Theocracy simply means the rule by God as opposed to democracy, which is the rule by the people, for the people, etc. So it was then the rule by God and of course for the people, but for God's glory ultimately. So I would like for us to understand, for some of you perhaps to remember, that ancient Israel was governed through theocracy, which is the rule by God, and timeless moral values that are cross-cutting, right? So whether ancient Israel's theocracy or modern Zimbabwe's democracy, there are certain universal, certain moral, timeless values that are cross-cutting, that were applicable during the then theocracy mode of government, right? That was applicable then, but also still applicable to the now and current modern democracies. A careful examination of scriptures with an eye for detail clearly shows inter alia, justice, peace, culture of displacing my people. So the displacements and the demolitions did not start today. They were evil rulers then that would, demolish, people's homes, and the prophets would not go quiet when that would happen. So I'm saying here, justice was at the heart of God many years ago, just like it remains on his heart even today. The demand for peace was quite central then, even as it is today. Now, the entire scripture, the entire body of scripture really teaches and talks about justice. And Matthew chapter number 23, verse 23. Christ ridicules or makes parody of the Pharisees for pushing one agenda and neglecting other important agenda. And then he says to these Pharisees, you hypocrites, you talk about payment of tithe, you talk about payment of tithe, but you disregard weightier matters of the law, right? And then one of these weightier matters of the law, Christ says, you have disregarded mercy, you have disregarded justice. You should have done and taught on tithe without neglecting justice, because justice is a weightier matter regarding the law. So I've always insisted to pastors and say, look, guys, it is very important for people to collect tithes and to teach on tithes. But you know that justice issues are weightier before God. And a lot of my fellow pastors who don't want to talk about justice, not only because they will be arrested, but simply because they will not harvest the money from teaching justice, but rather tithes, right? That is also why God will ensure that with the rise of every king, there would be prophets that would hold the king and his kingdom accountable. In other words, the tenets of governance were at the heart of God. There would never be a king and you would not have a prophet that would actually hold that king accountable. All right? Moses and Aaron held Pharaoh accountable when he oppressed the children of Israel in a foreign land. Okay? Prophet Elijah held King Ahab accountable when the latter forcibly took Naboth's land. Right. Am I talking to the people that are Bible readers, users, and believers here? Hello? Am I? Is that all right? Are we together? You know the story of Naboth? No, not too sure. Yeah, the story of Naboth. His land was confiscated and taken by King Ahab with the aid of Jezebel, Madame Queen. Right. And Prophet Elijah did not go quiet about that. So I think it's a very important role of it. Held King David accountable when he took Uriah's wife and later on killed him at the forefront of the battle. So that was your David. Right. So what I'm saying here is that the church has always had a role in governance issues and in ensuring that justice prevailed, in ensuring that accountability happened, in ensuring that peace happens. So we are saying equally so today, the church has got to rise to the occasion And you guys, you are members of your churches in one way or the other. It will be very, very important to input into the policy of the church regarding the church's position on matters of human rights. You know, human rights is as old as human rights as a concept is as old as humanity itself. 2,000 years ago, Paul was already talking about it when he was arrested and then flogged. And then he challenged this Roman citizen, the Roman soldier, and he said to him, do you think it is legal? Is it legal for you to beat a Roman citizen who is not yet tried? Right? And then the soldier was shocked. Paul was very clear about human rights. And at some point he's giving a defense. And this other zealous high priest said to the people that is stood with Paul, would you hit Paul on the mouth so that he shuts up? And then Paul looks at him and says, you whitewashed wall. You speak the law of God, and yet you command that I be beaten. And then the people say, do you know who you are talking to? You are talking to a high priest. And then Paul says, oh, I see, madam, I didn't know that he was a high priest. You understand what I'm talking about? So we have a church today which pushes for hyper spirituality, which is void of the substance of the truth of the word of God. So the Bible says you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. So we don't worship God in spirit only, but we worship God in truth. In other words, in substance. It's not just about spirituality, spiritualizing. And then there's no substance to that. What is the truth? What is the word of God saying? The word of God is saying, stop abductions. Stop human rights violations. Stop lying. Now, church's interface with unjust systems. This is my next topic here. Church's interface with unjust systems. Now, the overarching question here is how should the church in particular and the citizenry in general interface with the unjust laws? That is, laws that fall short in terms of the supremacy of the standard of God, of the word of God that is contained in the law of the land. But more importantly, this gives us the basis of the theology of civil disobedience. It says, can unjust leaders, take note, can unjust leaders claim that God is on their side? Can unjust leaders claim that God is on their side? Leaders whose decrees permit injustice. So there is an oxymoron there. Leaders whose decrees or whose statutes permit injustice. How do statutes permit injustice? Right? This is according to New Living Translation. But another version, I think your International Version says, can wicked rulers be allied with God, with you, O God? Can wicked rulers be allied with you, God? Those who frame injustice using statutes or using the law. The other version says they frame mischief using the law. So you can have a government that puts up a law
and it becomes law, but that law is meant to cause mischief. The Bible says that is what wicked rulership does. All right? So, you have illegal legalities. It's legal. If you don't observe it, they will arrest you. But how legal is that legality when you compare it with the supreme law of the land, and when you compare it also with the supreme law, which is the scriptures? Right. So, this is how we interface with unjust systems. The Bible says there are such laws. What do you do with such laws? Now, I want to show you further biblical evidence of resistance, which is actually anchored on this theology. Number one, now there is a young man called Jonathan, Saul's son, who resisted his father Saul's instruction to have David killed. That is 1 Samuel chapter number 20, verse 30 to 35. Excuse me. Right? 1 Samuel chapter number 20, verse 30 to 35. I think you might want to take note of that, because it is very important. That gives us a very clear evidence that laws that are unjust can simply be resisted and disobeyed. What had happened? David had been anointed king, but of course, Saul had continued ruling. So the emergence of David as an upcoming young ruler meant that Saul was not going to continue reigning, but also it meant that his son Jonathan was not going to succeed Saul. And so Jonathan and Saul and David were close friends. And David and Jonathan had agreed that David would not be where his life was in danger. So one of these days, David did not appear on the king's table because Saul had planned to kill him. And Saul said to his son Jonathan, where is the son of Jesse? And of course, Jonathan protected David and said, he has asked leave of me and has gone to his place. And then Saul was angry and he said to Jonathan, don't you know that you are in support of David to your own demise? And then he threw the javelin that he was supposed to kill David. And then Jonathan knew that this was meant for David to die. In fact, Saul had said to Jonathan, go and fetch David right now. He must die. And then Jonathan said, why must David die? Why should he die? So we need people that can be able to ask these questions. And these are things that we are sharing with the communities. Why should the supporter of an opposition die? And I'm glad that we, as we work in the communities there, I remember we shared exactly what I'm sharing with you with the ZANU-PF youths out there in Hurunga West. And there stood a young man, a son of a war veteran. And he said, we want to thank God for these teachings. And we want to make this known to the church that we are the Jonathan generation. We are not going to be on a killing spree. So we are noting transformation. Because all what we need to do is to make sure that dictatorship has no multiple hands. Dictatorship will not have multiple eyes, no multiple ears. And when we do that, it is not going to be easy for violence to be perpetrated. But also Saul's foot soldiers resisted his instruction to have killed the priests of the Lord, whom he accused to have been conniving with David. This is also 1 Samuel chapter number 22, verse 17 to 18. Saul instructed his bodyguards, fall on the priests, kill them, because they are on the side of David. And the priest said, no, we will not touch, we will not shed innocent blood. And then, of course, he instructed one who was called Doeg. And the Doeg, there are always Doegs around. Doeg overzealously killed the priest of God. Now, so verse number 17 says, and he ordered his bodyguards, kill these priests of the Lord. Kill the priests of the Lord. For they are allies and conspirators with David. They knew he was running away from me, but they didn't tell me. But Saul's men refused to kill the Lord's priests. Verse number 18, then the king said to Doeg, you do it. So Doeg, the Edomite, turned on them and killed them that day, 85 priests, in all still wearing their priestly garments. So they were killed in their priestly garments. But I've just shown you the evidence of how ungodly orders can be defied. But third example, Apostle Peter and company resisted the ruler's instruction for them to stop preaching in the name of Jesus. But Peter and the apostles replied, we must obey God rather than any human authority. This is Acts chapter number 5, verse 29. So, ongoing work, as I draw to a conclusion, ongoing work to preserving peace. What is it that we do? I've already alluded to this. Now, we've been trying to engage also our security, or ZRP, and I think it's been quite exciting to really note how willing they have been to hear what the church says. What we have also been very clear, as my brother, the first presenter, said, is that, you see, do you know that our police, without political interference, they are very efficient and quite professional, right? I mean, there are certain acts of criminality that have happened here, and the police have caught up with the perpetrators. I remember at some point, there was a hit and run incident at Girls High there, where this reckless driver ran over a young girl, and he ran away, and in a week's time, he was caught at Polokwane there. And remember, I think last year, there were shootouts in Chifu. Barely within 24 hours, those shooters were caught. Right. So when there is no interference, Rashida Zao Basara was fair. They do very well. I remember they entertained me when I went to see them. I had a complaint and they handled me with care. And I said to them, I am going to talk good about you guys, you particularly. But you see, we also are aware that when they are interfered, that's when they will tell you, geopolitics at bat. You know what happened in 2008? I was the politics at Tom at bat. Can matter that the politics when people are being killed, right? We have, as different churches groupings, been working in different parts of the country as well, setting up local peace committees and proclaiming the gospel of peace, right? We've had many people responding to this gospel, and the aforementioned portions of scriptures have also been used to empower citizens to resist being used by politicians, right? To violate their own, But also we've made use of certain portions of scriptures, like your 1 Kings chapter number 2, verse 5 to 7. A portion of scripture which actually talks about Joab, who killed during the time of peace and was not prosecuted then. But then David ordered before he died that Solomon should do justice to Joab because he had shed the innocent blood. So we have been talking about this. We have talked about the power of three liquids. Do not shed blood. Do not cause, tears to come down. Worry to destroy a home that somebody's sweat has oozed. So three liquids: ropa, misods, what is it on? Sweat, right? Sweat, blood, and tears. Now, and this has appealed so much to our people who understand Zimbabwe. And there's been repentance. And I'm telling you, repentance. Just like yesterday, we had about 300 community members in one of the rural areas, in remote areas there, with over 30 village heads, people, war veterans and past perpetrators of violence who were literally making confessions. Now, I want to appeal to the church, that anybody from the church that is here, this kind of gospel, when you proclaim it unambiguously, it will come powerfully to the people, and people will repent. They will fear to commit further atrocities. The impact has been phenomenal. Yeah, with former perpetrators, violence now championing peace. Right. Let me just conclude by making reference to the American human rights defender who lived way back, Martin Luther King Jr. I call him a prophet of justice. Now, Martin Luther King Jr. writes, any religion that professes to be concerned about the souls of men and is not concerned about the slums that damn them. In other words, if you just get concerned with the souls of men, but without concerning yourself with the slums that damn them, the economic conditions that strangle them, and the social conditions that cripple them, that religion is spiritually moribund. Moribund religion, awaiting burial. If something is moribund, it is in the intensive care unit. Any religion that baptizes people, that gets people to speak with tongues, get baptized in the Holy Spirit, and you preach on a Sunday, you bury the dead, but you don't question why the dead are dying, why people are dying. Any such religion that does not concern itself with the slums that cripple people, social conditions that strangle them, that religion is spiritually moribund. It is sick to the core, and it awaits burial. And Martin Luther does not want to have anything with that kind of religion. I will not have anything to do with such. And I want to challenge us to have a living religion. A religion that does not, it puts segments to our lives on Sunday and separates that from our lives between Monday and Saturday. So this is how the church views it, and this is what the church has been doing in communities. And I believe very strongly that these workshops that we're going to hold will one day yield fruit, so that we see a significant reduction of human rights violation, so that it does not just become a culture of workshopping, but to say, at which point would we say as Zimbabweans, this is enough? Ladies and gentlemen, I thank you.
Amen. Thank you so much, Bishop Magai.
such an eloquent presentation, and it was so informing, and really it also looked at the current environmental context in which we are operating. Thanks so much, Bishop. I almost started to repent all my sins, as you were really saying things yesterday. And I was touched by the reality that most of us, particularly in the leadership, we are like whitewashed tombs, which outwardly beautiful, but inside full of dead men's bones. So I think tichabatsirika Bishop kuti tikwanise kudarika izvozvo. Ndinoimba mamuka zvakanaka, ndivuke njani, mauyani. My name is George Makon. I'm from the Weather Residence Development Initiative Trust, an organization which works in Weather, Mashonaland East, to promote the participation of residents in democracy and development issues. And currently, we are conducting a peace building and conflict management project which seeks to bring the communities together. And I want to say that this session resonates well with what is happening in our community, particularly as Vachiri Mambua has made an analysis in terms of the general formalization of the economy and how it has implications in how we relate at community level and even with our leadership, and also how issues like assault of judiciary, the politicization of the security sector, militarization of public affairs, shrinking of civic space, and citizens becoming very individualistic. I think, Comrade Chimambua, these issues are quite genuine. And you went on to ask who are the political actors and what are the drivers. And I think as we are sitting where we are, we have these questions on the presentation which he has made. So without preempting everything, I'm going to open this time to all of us who might have some questions, comments, additions, and subtractions. And equally, as we think, another presentation by Malvin also touched on the media, the fourth estate in Zimbabwe. How accessible is it to us as citizens, and how independent are we in terms of the access to information, and even in terms of having a say when it comes to coming up with content, and in terms of even who controls the media. I think he has really articulated on those issues. And of particular interest, he also talked about the Data Protection Act, how it is relevant to us, and how is it going to improve maybe the cyberbullying which has been there, and so forth. And Bishop also brought in the issue of Bible and governance, and really showing how bad it is to craft statutes permitting injustice. He talked of framing mischief using statutes, and he has emphasized that even in the times of canonical prophets, canonical and pre-canonical prophets, the issue of injustice was there. Displacements and demolitions were there. So I think without wasting much time, we can also have our say on this before we proceed to the next session. Any takers? Should I move around with the mic?
Yes.
So that's,
Thank you very much, Andrea. And thanks to the three speakers. Am I being audible? Yeah, I just wanted to add a few thoughts just to tie up the three great presentations. I think one thing that we also need to debate is to try to understand the nature of the Zimbabwean state. Right from independence, I think the first decade of independence, there was a loud call by the ruling party to declare Zimbabwe a de jure one-party state, which means one-party state at law that was going to be legislated. And that plan was only pushed back by the Western donor nations who said they are not going to cooperate or to give money to a communist regime that does not allow other voices in society. And they abandoned that in 1990 when ZUM was formed. But even back in that decade of the 80s, there was gross intolerance of the opposition. I was a kid living in Zwaresekwa in 1985. I remember after the election, ZAPU maintained, I think the 26th they had won in 1980. After that election, ZAPU officials were handed in their homes. And one of them, called Chauruka, he was lynched by the public and he died by public stoning. And we come to the 90s decade, there was no strong opposition. But what many people did not understand is that the country had become a de facto one-party state, where the opposition was allowed to exist on paper, but not allowed to compete for power. And then we come to 1999, when the MDC was formed, and we know what happened in 2000. The land reform program was again a reminder that this is a one-party state. And the violence that we experienced from 2000, which culminated with the June killings of 2008, was another reminder that this is a one-party state. So much of the violations we've talked about need to be understood in that context, that the opposition in Zimbabwe is there for window dressing, not to compete for power. And Dr. Chilumambua talked about the issue of informalization of the economy. This was not a mistake. It's not like the economy just collapsed because of market forces or market issues. It was noted that the formation of the MDC, there were three legs that formed the MDC. Number one, it was the organized labor. Number two, it was civil society. Number 3, the students' movement. So, to demobilize organized labor, they had to attack, number 1, farming, because we had about 500,000 unionized farm workers. Number 2, we had a vibrant industry by 2000, and we had hundreds of thousands of unionized workers. So to demobilize them, let's attack the industry. Let's destroy, Kondozi farm. I think we know what happened to that farm in Manicaland. They destroyed every form that created a space for organized labor. And then, of course, the rest is history. So when the problem now, I'm concluding now. Civil society today, I think we have put the leg off the accelerator and pretending to be reforming the state. And a lot of, I'm also in civil society. A lot of my colleagues, when they have a meeting with a minister, they want to take it as a sign of achievement, some sign of progress. They want to tell their donors that we had a meeting with the minister. But these are the same ministers Bishop Magai has been talking about, who have been framing laws, draconian, satanic, evil laws that make us passengers in our own country, that make us foreigners in our own country. So a complete analysis of the one-party state nature that we operate in is very important. 2023 is coming. Already 2 weeks ago, someone was buried in Mashingo. And expect more people to die because the real beast has not been exposed as to what is the problem that we are confronting. And the problem is we have a ruling party that believe they've got title deeds of the land between the Zambezi and the Limpopo. And they are saying, if you want to change or remove us from power, then you must also go and get guns the way we did to liberate the country. And I think this is the conversation we need to have, not the conversation to import guns, but to say, given the thinking that is in government, the terrorist mentality that if you don't belong to us, we all know that if you are in civil society, if you are in the opposition in Zimbabwe, state security is withdrawn from you. You do it at your own peril. And what kind of country is that? How can you organize? How can you mobilize even people to say, let's go into the street and say, we don't want this bill, we don't want this practice? How can you organize in such an environment? And I think Bishop Magaya, this is one thing that people like you also need to help enlighten society that we are not a democracy, we are a one-party state. And stop to live a lie. I see some people already are preparing for elections and say, they're getting money to prepare for elections. That is not an election. It's an endorsement. In Zimbabwe, we don't hold elections, we hold endorsements. So do we want to continue with endorsements? Or we should say, we draw a line in the sand and say, guys, enough is enough. Let's create a better Zimbabwe, where all people have got opportunities, where we live as brothers and sisters, where institutions protect citizens and not a political party. Thank you.
Thank you very much, especially to the three presenters, Mr. Chirimamboa, Brother Malvin, and Bishop Magaya. As I said in my introduction, I am Reverend Charles Masunungure, the Executive Director of the Zimbabwe Peace Building Trust. I came here also so I could learn from colleagues in the CSO sector. And from the presentations, I wouldn't want to go back and emphasize on what they've already said because that would be like repeating. But I want to pick up on something that I believe will help us to focus into the future, because as peace building practitioners, we have got our foundations as well. I know that colleagues who are human rights based have their areas of emphasis and focus. So first of all, as we look at 2023, I read the concept note for this workshop, and I realized that one of the things that we are supposed to look at is how then can we avoid the conflict, violent conflict in the coming elections. And I have a number of suggestions to us. The first one being the building of capacity to community leadership. I agree with Mr. Chirimamboa that there is a shift from national CSOs to CBOs. They are very effective because they have access which national organizations do not have. I'm sure you all know that there's this issue of clearances from provincial ministers and stuff. These clearances are not difficult to get for CBOs because they are where the people are. They know the language to speak and they can have access. So my proposal would be that there is need for capacity building of local leaders like traditional and religious leaders, peace building practitioners in conflict prevention, management, resolution, and transformation. The second thing that I believe would help us is to set up preventive action and social cohesion mechanisms, such as peace committees. I know that Zimbabwe and ZDD by the Bishop have done tremendous work in setting up some committees that act as conflict early warning and early response mechanisms in the communities. And by strengthening the capacity of these, it will become very easy for us to curtail violent conflict and also prevent it from happening. And then the third thing that is very important, which Zimbabwe Peace Building Trust does and was formed for, is the issue of building bridges between CSOs and government and promote constructive dialogue. I know that we have been advocating for this since we set up this organization, that yes, there is the approach which is confrontational, which works for others. But for us as peace building entities is the issue that we need to create space for constructive dialogue where we can, as Zimbabweans, discuss our differences and say, okay, yes, you are putting forth this, or maybe you have passed the law on the PVOs and stuff, but to what extent does it promote development in the provinces? I remember 2 weeks ago, we hosted a meeting between the security sector, CSOs, PDC's office in Mashula and Central and Bindura, and we had very interesting conversations. And we believe that this building of bridges will help us reduce the tensions as we go further and further towards or closer and closer to the elections. You will see that the need to engage will be very important. And of course, the fourth and almost the last is the issue of engaging at the level of dealing with intra-party conflict. I know that many of us program at the level of inter-party conflict where we believe that there is a conflict between ZANU-PF and MDC. But have you noticed that the intra-party conflict within MDC or within ZANU-PF is actually the foundation upon which inter-party conflict is built? So it will be a very good thing. It's challenging, yes, but it's important to begin to build a culture of tolerance within political parties, between political actors themselves. For example, when there are elections to choose a candidate for the political party, the loser does not cooperate with the winner, and the winner doesn't cooperate with the loser. And therefore, if we help build tolerance within those political parties to say, yes, you have won, yes, you have lost, when we then go to engagement between political parties, it becomes, we would have set a very good foundation. And the last one, I wanted to talk about the need to shift from focusing only on political conflicts. And I saw the presentation by Mr. Chirimamboa was showing us a plethora of human rights violations that may not necessarily be political. For example, a machete gang has nothing to do with politics. For example, if they are underground there, it has nothing to do with politics. It's about to tap into the resource that is underground. To what extent can we begin to see the activity of CSOs around curtailing violations of human rights that have nothing to do with politics? Because these are the same people that you then see when it is a political conflict. They are the same people that you see moving into that space, but they have been trained every day by engaging in intolerance in their local spaces away from politics. Thank you very much.
Right, I'm Ronnie. Thanks to the three presenters. I'm sure we're all aware that Zimbabwe has undergone through a major economic, political shift, and this has had a profound impact on both urban and rural livelihoods. But my focus is mainly going to be on the rural livelihoods. One of the presenters mentioned how the numbers in workers' unions have decreased and so forth. But if we really looked at what happened to, for example, to the farm workers who were employed before the fast track land reform, where are they? What is it that they are doing? Has they ever been given any support either from the government, from the civil society? Is there anything that we're doing towards that? Because on a daily basis, as they interact with young people who had their parents lost their jobs, they're now scattered all over in the rural areas. They have nothing to do. They have no one to collaborate with. I mean, we have, you just mentioned about social cohesion is a key issue in the social and community context domain. But probably the question is has there been collaboration even from the civil society in terms of trying to improve livelihoods of young people in the rural areas? We have no access to capital, we have no access to information, we have no access to the markets. What is it that we are doing? We love to talk about peace. Can we talk about peace when the bread and butter issues are not really addressed, when the time is hungry? How do I engage young people and tell them that we want to talk about rights when they have nothing that is sustaining them? I think we also need to consider on how best we can collaborate in these communities so that these livelihoods can be improved, so that they can have some way to have access to something. For example, I mean, for those who had their parents lose jobs during the fast track land reform and so forth, most of them, the majority of them, did not even manage to get basic education, which basically means that they don't have access to information. They don't understand the language that we are speaking right now in this conference. Even if you had to go back to them and try to explain these acts and so forth, they have no knowledge about those things. So what is it that we can do to ensure that at grassroots level, people really understand these issues? And secondly, I want to talk about the role of the church. I mean, it's very good. The church has always played a very important role in terms of peace. But there has been a shift, and us as young people, we have been worried. I mean, the churches of late have been perpetrators of violence due to leadership and so forth. Can we really look up to the church right now and say, maybe the church will be able to assist us to have peace in Zimbabwe with the recent events that have happened in different churches that we have been reading about? Thank you.
Yeah, then the first one is
Okay, just starting from where you left, talking about violence within churches. And Mr. Chimambo mentioned about violence when it comes to vending space and so forth. So I just wanted to highlight one thing. Violence seems as if it's our language in any kind of conflict in Zimbabwe. The reason is that we can just go back during the struggle and so forth. Everyone who have been perceived as a sellout, violence was perceived as the solution. That language of violence, even though we don't talk about it like every day, subconsciously we resort to violence whenever differences come within political parties, when you are arguing about vending stores and so forth. So the conversation, I think, thinking about 2022 going forward should be around how best can we go and try to change that consensus on how to solve differences. I want to highlight this. The language that we use, for example, there is the slogan, the Pasina. Every time I hear the slogan, honestly, I cringe, just because easy history in the struggle was used to reference killing someone must go down, must be buried. So that kind of language, as long as it exists, subconsciously it fuels us to continue thinking in terms of violence. So there is a movement that I respect so much, the women's movement. It's a made strides, a lot of strides for the past 50 years. They attacked the language. You should not say this, you should not say that. So there are some words which are now taboo to say in society to a woman just because they've actually asserted that in our discourse. So I think when we talk about peace, let us try to find those words which perpetuates the thinking of solving every problem using violence, and try to make sure that we can push them to be taboos in our society. By doing such things, our young generation will have a new thinking on how to solve problems. Because if you join a political party today and the language is the language of violence, then when you grow up, when you become the party leader and so forth, you continue to groom the same language of violence. Zimbabwe need to shift the language that we talk about when we are talking about differences, and try to find new words which actually express peace, not the words which actually cement violence. Thank you.
Thanks for these brilliant questions and comments. I think our questions basically were centering on what we can do to prevent violence in the next elections. And I want also our presenters to respond to what Mr. Magu has said on when he referred to elections as just an endorsement and not an election. And also, Ronnie talked of lack of knowledge in communities as the major cause for the problems we are having. And he has asked whether the civic society has made efforts to make a follow-up on how those displaced workers are doing, what are the youth doing as a way of sustaining their livelihoods in communities, and how we can collaborate as civic society organizations to ensure that we solve the challenge. Then about the church bishop, it was asked if we can really look up to the church in this dispensation, given how difficult it is to work with violence as a language in all the conflicts. Then on how we can solve the conflicts in a peaceful manner. So I will give the presenters maybe 2 minutes each to present before we go to the next to the next presentations, because we still have presentations by NGO Forum and another one from Mr. Terence Chitapi. And would there be any questions, or after that we go to the next presentations? House? Okay. Who starts? Maybe Bishop.
All right, thank you. Well, yeah, let me leave the question around elections, the endorsements, elections or endorsements to others. But what I hear my brother there saying is that as Zimbabweans, we can determine the kinds of elections that we want. And I think let's converse more on that. But just to respond on the church, whether we can look up to the church, because the church has also become a source of conflict and violence, and very, very true. We have had serious problems within the church, ranging from splits and even real fights. And I'm sure that this has not been looking good. I think what we need to understand is that the source of violence, the people that have always perpetrated violence in this nation have a background. We have had cycles, like we've just said. I mean, even right from the pre-colonial era, colonial, and then of course post-independence. And what we have always insisted is the fact that we need to get to a point where we say enough is enough. We are not going to resolve our challenges through violence. So it is unfortunate that the church has, or some section of the church, has not been able to live up to that standard. But I'm also glad to say that it is not everything about the church, or it is not the entire church. You will always have some bad elements within the church. And I think we need to clearly delineate and to distinguish between that, to say, yes, we've got these that have done this, but it doesn't mean that in the entire church has been spoiled. But certainly, yes, it is very unfortunate that the church has become less effective simply because of these challenges. In fact, you will discover that particularly coming from the big churches, and you have such challenges, and you begin to realize why we do not have a voice of reason from the churches or from such sections of the churches, because they are also part of the problem and part of the violence. Thank you.
Where are we going? Are we coming to him? Oh, okay. So this one.
Yeah. I think mostly what were raised were comments, and I do share some sentiments with some of the comments. I agree with some, and I think the bishop has already spoken on the issue of the elections, and to say, are we under the issue of the one-party state? The very persuasive and convincing argument for us. And I think the ruling party has always been trying to ensure that they're the only dominant political player. And certainly the road to 2023 elections doesn't look great. And this is why even in my trying to analyze, I took a much broader, I went beyond elections so that it can help us to begin to think around how we make interventions. And then there were some who asked about the farm workers, what happened to them, the changes. These people eventually got absorbed into society. Some became beneficiaries also of the land reform, and some went into artisanal mining, into other sources of livelihood. But what was critical there is about the decimations of the unions, which were built around the agro-based economy that you could talk about Gapus then, but now there's no more Gapus to talk about. It no longer has that big membership. It's something which remains on. So it is about that change and to say what then does it mean in terms of social organizing or in terms of civics. I think that was my key point of intervention. And in terms of collaboration from civil society, helping, I mean, quite a lot of work has been done. I know there are organizations like Farm Community Trust, Zimbabwe Community Development Trust, even the CSU then when it was Amani Trust, it played quite a, and even to some extent, even you, Zimbabwe. So they've been working and interact. So there's a lot which has been done by civil society to try and assist farm workers. But then my point was not necessarily on that, but was to say, are we noticing the changes that happened within the farming sector, where we used to have large unions which used to thrive and were actually at the center, at the center of the struggles for democratization, the centers for the struggle for human rights in Zimbabwe. These unions were very critical, but they are no longer there. It's like they've become extinct like dinosaurs. So it was mainly about that change. I think that is where my point of intervention was. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Maybe I'll also just respond to that issue of elections being a mere formality. From the perspective of the media, I think there have been efforts that have been made to ensure that elections adhere to the international standards that are laid down. For example, SADC has its own principles about how the media should behave during elections. Our own laws here, such as our electoral laws, also are very clear on how the media should behave, how much coverage they should give people during the election time. So for me, it's a matter of trying to ensure that those standards and those provisions that have been given are followed, that we carefully monitor them. Where they are not followed, perhaps people can go to court. I gave an example of how ZBC was judged to have not to be acting in line with the electoral laws of the land when they were giving coverage during elections. So a lot would depend on how we also fashion our advocacy, measuring them against the provisions that we already have. Of course, there have been instances where this government has been known not to follow court rulings. Maybe one can think about that issue of Chief Charumbira, where the court ruled in a certain manner, but he has sort of defied what the court has said. So those instances may come, but it's better for us to have exhausted all avenues that we have and then make a position that it will be a formality rather than not to exercise the options that we have. We have existing reports from SADC, from EU. How are we going to use them as benchmarks to ensure that the next election is free and fair? But also the media has a role to play in terms of ensuring that we have a free and fair election. How are we going to ensure that the media is not a pusher of hate speech, intimidatory language that denigrates women and push them out of our politics? All those things, they will require to be monitored for us to see whether we are going in the right direction. And I think it can be done. We don't have many choices. We had a new constitution in 2013. We have to ensure that it's adhered to. Of course, others may think confrontation is a better option, but as it is now, we have a constitution that has not yet been fully implemented, and perhaps it will be in our favor to ensure that we work with CPOs, we work with ordinary citizens to ensure that the constitution is implemented fully.
As we are now going forward, one of our presenters who had not yet arrived has finally arrived. I'm talking of a presenter from the National Transitional Justice Working Group, Mr. Fortune Guzewe. Is going to take us through the state of human rights in Zimbabwe, and no doubt that he is going to address it well, Mr. Fortune.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And I would like to apologize, colleagues, for coming through a bit late. I was saving humanity in Mutare. I want to start by thanking you, Zimbabwe Trust, for spearheading the campaign to remember Theo. He was one of the finest. There's a brother of mine who tried to tell us the root of the conflict in Zimbabwe. My brother, the executive is at war. It has not stopped warring ever since we got independence. And this is the reason why we have these cycles of violence. There was no proper demobilization and reintegration of our people. So in their mindset, they're still fighting. And as we go forward, we're expecting that violence will become part of our DNA as Zimbabweans, which it has actually become now. As we all know, we are now a purely militarized state, and violence begets violence. The problem of coming in late is everyone else will know you, and you will not know anyone, except for those people that you are used to seeing. So I acknowledge Mkoma, Magu, Chilemambo Ade, Bishop Magaya, thank you so much, and all the other guys that I have not mentioned. It's truly a pleasure for me to be here today. So the greatest challenge that we have is building on from the militarization I was talking about. We have two broad concepts. I'm not going to lecture, I'm just going to highlight them. We have a concept of state security. I think we all used to hear the former President Robert Mugabe saying, our sovereignty, our sovereignty. This theory talks more of protecting the boundaries of the country, and it neglects the person in the country. And that's the next concept I want to highlight, the concept of human security. And this is the concept that is lacking in our country. And this is one of the root problems that has led us to where we are today. So just to give a bit of context, I'm supposed to talk about the human rights violations. I hear there were references from what my good brother has talked about, Dr. Chilemamboa. He has stolen my thunder, but I'll try to complement what he has said. The National Transitional Justice Working Group, just to give you a background, is a platform for transitional justice stakeholders. It is housed within the Zimbabwe Human Rights NGO Forum. So as I am representing the working group, I'm also representing the Zimbabwe Human Rights NGO Forum on behalf of Dr. Kika. So in 2021, as we all remember, it started off with the national lockdown, and as is with all the national lockdowns that we had before, it was marred with cases of human rights violations. They continued unabated. We had state security officers, particularly our military, which is now working as an auxiliary force in the streets, dealing and interacting with civilians, which is not the best possible principle of dealing with civilians. And this is, as I highlighted, one of the problems that we have. When we look at the number of violations that we have documented from 2017 going forward, it has surpassed the numbers of violations that were documented between 2013 to 2017. And one would be then keen to know why we have these violations. And the answer is simple, colleagues. Our colleagues are still fighting. Unfortunately, they are fighting unarmed people. So during the COVID-19 violations, lockdown, I mean, we documented a couple of violations that were directly related to COVID-19 related enforcement. We documented 3 cases of extrajudicial killings, which involved, one of the cases involved a gentleman who stood up against partisan distribution of food aid that was being done. And this guy was then dragged and assaulted by a combination of ZANU-PF supporters as well as ZRP supporters, ZRP officers, pardon me. This is a widely circulated case, but it's an illustration of how the COVID-19 lockdown also, emanated in human rights violations being perpetrated. We also had a couple of abductions. Those, though they were not really related to COVID-19, I'll talk about them a bit later when I talk about the general human rights violations that we recorded. But we also had a lot of unlawful arrests, arbitrary arrests and arbitrary detention, which were compounded by prolonged detention in prisons without people facing trial and being exonerated. So basically, the issue of one being innocent until proven guilty was thrown out of the bin. And we had a lot of people who were persecuted and punished through the judiciary system. We also had a lot of cases of intimidation. We recorded a maximum of 500 cases of intimidation. This also was as a result of the COVID-19 lockdown. So all in all, we had 1,333 cases that can be disaggregated and directly linked to the enforcement of the COVID-19 lockdown, as well as the direct result of the COVID-19 regulations. So I'll move on to organized violence and torture. We documented a total of 1,111 cases between January and October. Some of these cases were documented by some of our members, like the Zimbabwe Peace Project, and we just disaggregate them and put them there. Of concern, though, is that we had 7 killings. And remember, I talked about the other killings that were linked to the COVID-19. And when I say killings, it's extrajudicial killings. It's unlawful killings. So we had 7 such cases. And then we also had 4 abductions that took place. Those were politically motivated abductions. Though we might say it's a little bit of a decrease from the cases that we had in 2019, where we had 82 abductions. And in 2020, we documented 24 abductions. We are still concerned that we still have these medieval tactics of intimidating people still taking place, where you uproot someone and you just do whatever you want with them. And this is a true cause for concern. We also had cases of assault and torture. In our definition of torture, it's directly linked to state action against civilians. So we are not talking about inter-party violence or intra-party violence. We are talking of police officers, law enforcement officers directly attacking, physically attacking citizens. We had a total of 152 cases. We also had a couple of malicious damage to property cases, which were 53, and partisan distribution of food and agricultural aid, which totaled at 126. And we also had a total of 12 attacks against journalists. My brother from MISA understands how frustrating it is for one to be persecuted for doing the job that you are supposed to, even though there are standards that are supposed to be adhered to locally and internationally. So I will just take one of the examples on the extrajudicial killings, and I shall read. In Gweru, a guy called Tatenda Pasignore was arrested by police officers. The police officers went on to assault Pasignore with blunt objects, which included baton sticks. Pasignore sustained injuries to his hips, as well as a deep cut on the wrist, legs, and also in the armpit. A day later, Pasignore died in the cells and he succumbed to the injuries that he sustained during the assault. I will not add anything else. I will move on to socio-economic rights. as we all agree, and probably Dr. Chirimamboa talked about this in his presentation, we have a new kid on the block. We have a 50 state in Zimbabwe. That is the business. The business has become an institution of its own. And through that, we have also seen human rights violations directly linked to, the impunity that is being enjoyed by business personnel. And we can talk of the issues to do with the Chilonga displacements, development-induced displacements, which my brother Farai, Mr. Magu would be better placed to talk of. But we have also noticed this increase. We have the Inde case in Wange. We have also the cases in Mutoko that are taking place there as a result of business-related displacement. We also saw the destruction of vending stores, and it actually happened during one of the lockdowns in the beginning of the year. And we have to understand that almost 70% of people who are said to be employed with the extended definition of employment in Zimbabwe are informally employed. And at the height of the COVID lockdown, we then have, the state destroying vending stores without any alternative. And remember, all of these people were not earning anything since 30 March 2020 when the lockdown started. And in 2021, we also then saw them continuing not to earn by having their vending stores destroyed, their artificial workshops also destroyed. According to the World Bank, the latest World Bank economic update, Zimbabwe was classified as extremely poor. We all know that Zimbabwe constitutes the bottom billion citizens of the world, but when we have such a classification, it's a cause for concern, and it's a human rights issue as well. We will not talk about the silent genocide in the hospitals. We all know what's happening in our health sector, but I would like to point out the issue of partisan distribution of food in relation to socio-economic rights. Honestly, you cannot deprive someone of food based on their political affiliation at a time when everyone is crying, and then you just decide that no, because you have horns and I support the tail, so I'm not going to give you food. That is so inhumane, and we have to stand up and speak against that. This is also in relation to the findings of the Special Rapporteur on the right to food in her country visit to Zimbabwe, where she concluded that the poverty issues in Zimbabwe are actually man-made, in contrast to the common narrative that they are as a result of droughts and all of that. So these are some of the issues that we noticed on the socio-economic front. I've talked about the issue of the right to food, and also the World Food Program, just a bit of statistics as well. In their report also said that almost 8.6 million Zimbabweans are food insecure. I'm not going to also comment on that. I'll just let it sink. I've talked about the issue of business and human rights. Let me quickly move on to the issue of weaponization of the judiciary. I think it was at its height during the end of 2020 and the beginning of 2021. We have people like Makomborero who's still incarcerated at the moment. We also had a lot of other colleagues who spent prolonged periods of time in prisons. And this weaponization of the law is another issue of concern, because if the very same instrument that is supposed to protect the citizens is now being weaponized against them, it leaves us desperate without anywhere to turn to. I'll also talk about the decimation of our constitution that happened this year. We all know what happened with the Constitution Amendment number 2 bill, which then became an act, and you are all appraised of the attempts by the forum to reverse that through the Luke Malava case. But well, it happened. But I think it was a win for the little guy. The High Court judgment was a win for the little guy. We lost the battle, but at least we won a war. I'll also talk about the proposed further changes to the constitution. Just some 2 weeks or a week ago, we had the vice president, who's also the minister of health, at a public space where he was talking about the possibilities of them also amending the constitution to increase the term of office of the president. And if we look at this in view of the I don't want to say popular, for lack of a better word, infamous 2030 Tringeti Chipo. It then brings us, you know, it gives us a very shocking realization that it might actually happen. They've done it once, they will probably try and do it again. Let's learn from what we did wrong. Let's come together and try and stop any further decimations of our constitution. It's a progressive paper. Let's implement it. Let's not amputate it. And then I'll also talk about the elections. In view of the by-elections that have been looming, we all know how many seats are pending. I don't know if it's cowardice or not, but the tenets of a representative democracy is for people to have representation. And when we have more than 39 members of parliament and seats which are not, wherein people are not represented, it's a cause for concern. Are we still saying we're a democratic republic, or we are saying we're a banana republic? I will also not comment. I'll leave that to sink in. The scourge of Zimbabwe, everyone does it. Some do it better than others. Corruption. It's at every level. It's entrenched. It has resulted in a couple of violations, a lot. During the lockdown, particularly, there were cases in which those who were policing the checkpoints would require you to give them something for you to pass through. If not, you were then either arrested or you were detained, and if your stars were not with you, you'd be assaulted. So what should we do with this? How can we address it? Ladies and gentlemen, let's think about this as we will be doing our plenary session to discuss what we are going to do, the human rights situation in the forthcoming years. I also want to, I'll talk about the issue of the shrinking civic space last, because I think it's an issue for concern for everyone. But I want to briefly talk about our peace and reconciliation processes. Thank you, Commissioner Masunungure. I still call you Commissioner Reverend. I'm used to that. You saved us all in the NPRC, thank you. We have a challenge with our peace and reconciliation process. The first thing is, we do not know when the mandate of the NPRC is going to end. Is it going to end in 2023, having started its mandate when the constitution was, adopted in 2013, or is it going to end in 2028 when the NPRC Act having been, enacted in 2018? And this is a cause for concern, given that when you look at the past wrongs that have happened and the traction that we have in resolving those issues, we do not see a lot of, traction in the peace and reconciliation process. This is also compounded by, the seeming hijacking of the mandate of the NPRC that we've witnessed. We heard of the president going down to Matebeleland and engaging traditional leaders on the Kukura-Hundi matter. Probably that's the strategy, as we also noted that the Chiefs Council got more, disbursements from the annual budget than the NPRC and all the other constitutional commissions. I think it was 22 million more, RTGS more than the NPRC. So probably it's the strategy at the end of the day. But if we have an independent commission that is supposed to deal with these issues, don't you think we should try at least to make sure that they discharge their mandate and they're adequately funded? So I just wanted to highlight that issue. And of course, the issue of our elections being rituals. They come in, year out, the same cycle over and over again. We cry foul, we do everything. To that I'll say, register and vote. So the shrinking civic space. We have seen the PVU amendment bill. We have interacted with it, and the conclusion is that it's not a sincere document. It's not designed to do what they are purporting to deal with the FAFTA recommendations in terms of anti-terrorism. There are a lot, of issues within that document that if it is passed in its current state, the state of civil society in Zimbabwe is going to change. Now, the importance of civil society in Zimbabwe cannot be overemphasized. If you look at the proper historical narrative that we have in Zimbabwe about what happened, it's actually a narrative by CSOs. We have a situation where we have Victor's peace in Zimbabwe. The one who won is the one who's ruling. So they get to detect and tell us the history and tell us our history. And we have always had an alternate history from civil society organizations, starting with the breaking the silence report, coming through to all of the various pogroms that we have faced in our country. And it would be a real shame for all of that to just die down with this generation. So let's also try and come together and address this situation. The thing is, it will not stop with civil society organizations. There are some who think, no, this is just to deal with those people who eat donor money and all that stuff. People who are not informed about how civil society organizations work. It's also going to stretch to other institutions. We won't be surprised, Bishop Magaya, if faith-based institutions are also going to be, affected at a certain point along the way. Because remember, the trick is, if I step on your toe and you don't do anything, the next time I'll step on your feet, and the next time I'll break the leg. So let's try by all means to think outside of the box and try and deal with this issue as it is an existential issue for all civil society organizations. If you look at the impact of civil society organizations in Zimbabwe, you will then realize that we have been the anchor of this country for quite some time now, whether in the humanitarian sector or in the civil and political rights sector. And it's definitely also going to affect the humanitarian sector. So the message out there is, let's all come together, let's fight this. I rest my case.
Thank you very much, Fortune, from the National Transitional Justice Working Group, for really articulating how human rights are being violated at community level and national level, particularly by the state as perpetrators. We have those state repressive agents, what they are doing in communities, including even, depriving people of food, the basic rights. The issue of abductions, the issue of forced disappearances, the issues of torture. Some of them are going unreported, but Fortune thanks you gave us the statistics and even the forms of doing that. You also went on to give an analysis of how the civil society space is shrinking, the PVO bill, how it is being used to further shrink the civic society space. And I think you have set the tone on how we can also advocate to stop some of those draconian laws. You also talked about the weaponization of the judiciary, and I think it is quite critical in terms of giving a context of how the human rights situation is continuing to deteriorate. So I'm told now by my marsh that lunch is ready. So I think we can go for lunch. When we come back, we have another presentation from Crisis in Zimbabwe Coalition on the situation of human rights in the COVID era. Terence Chitapi is going to make the presentation. Then we have another plenary. Then we move like that. So for now, I think we can go and enjoy our lunch. I hope everyone has obtained the tickets. If you haven't, you can see Madam Mashu over there. Thank you.